The clinic was silent, smelling faintly of antiseptic and expensive white lilies. Basil sat alone in the glow of his iMac, reviewing the raw audio files for their $1 million promotional campaign. He clicked a track labeled CM_audio_raw_04. Instead of his wife's practiced, elegant script, he heard the rustle of silk. Then, a voice. It was Julian, the photographer. He's so obsessed with those porcelain veneers, he doesn't even look at the real you. And then came Camelia's laugh. It wasn't her polite society chuckle. It was a throaty, breathless sound of pure ecstasy, a sound Basil hadn't heard in 5 years. The audio continued, the wet sounds of kissing, the muffled moans right in his own clinic's dressing room. In that sterile, perfect office, Basil's heart didn't break. It turned to ice. If stories of glittering facades, dark secrets, and the devastating cost of betrayal speak to you, stay with me. The clinic on Rodeo Drive was a temple of artificial perfection. White marble floors reflected the soft, ambient LED lighting, and the air was perpetually filtered to smell of nothing but crisp ozone and faint, expensive lilies. At 11:45 p.m., Dr. Basil Vance sat alone in his private office, a glass of Macallan 18 sweating onto a coaster beside his glowing iMac. He was supposed to be reviewing the final color grading for the Vance Veneer billboard campaign. His wife, Camelia, was the face of it. Of course she was. With her striking, symmetrical features and the flawless porcelain smile Basil himself had painstakingly crafted, she was the ultimate testament to his skill. Serafina, their aggressive PR manager, had dumped a massive folder of raw files onto the shared server earlier that evening. Just in case you want to pull any behind-the-scenes audio for the Instagram Reels, her email had read. Basil clicked into a subfolder labeled audio__outtakes. His mouse hovered over a file named CM_audio_raw_04 dressing room. He pressed the spacebar to play. At first, there was only the hollow, ambient hum of the studio's HVAC system and the sharp rustle of heavy silk. Camelia's gown. Basil took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes tired, waiting for her voice to test the lavalier mic she had forgotten to take off. God, finally, Camelia's voice filtered through the high-fidelity speakers. It sounded breathless. Rushed. Basil frowned. Careful with the dress, Jules. Serafina will have a stroke if it wrinkles. Jules. Julian. The campaign's lead photographer. A man with disheveled hair and a European accent that Beverly Hills wives found terribly authentic. Let her. Julian's voice murmured, a low baritone captured in terrifying clarity by the sensitive microphone. You look too tense, darling. The great doctor working you too hard? Basil's hand froze midair, the crystal glass hovering inches from his mouth. Camelia exhaled a sound that was half sigh, half groan. Basil? Basil doesn't work me at all. He's so obsessed with those damn porcelain veneers. He doesn't even look at the real me anymore. He touches my jawline like he's calculating a profit margin. Julian chuckled, a dark, intimate sound. Then came the shift of fabric. The unmistakable, wet sound of lips meeting skin. Then let me look at you, Julian whispered. Basil stopped breathing. The air in his lungs turned to shattered glass. Through the speakers, his wife let out a laugh. It wasn't the practiced, melodious chuckle she used at charity galas or dinners at Nobu. It was a throaty, guttural, unrestrained sound of pure, raw desire. It was a laugh she hadn't given Basil in 5 years. The audio tracked every detail. The harsh zipper of the dress, the heavy breathing, the soft, frantic moans echoing off the tiled walls of the dressing room, happening just 50 feet away from where Basil had been reviewing patient charts that very afternoon. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Basil sat paralyzed through every single second of it. When silence finally returned to the track, broken only by the click of a closing door, the office felt entirely different. The luxurious space didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a tomb. Basil slowly set the glass down. His pulse wasn't racing. He wasn't crying. The initial wave of suffocating heartbreak had burned out within the first 60 seconds, leaving behind something entirely different. A cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. She wasn't just cheating. She was mocking him. While spending his money, wearing the smile he built, and starring in a campaign financed by his sweat. He looked at the framed photograph on his desk, Camellia smiling brilliantly on their wedding day in Lake Como. He reached out, his perfectly steady surgeon's hands grasping the silver frame, and gently placed it face down on the mahogany wood. He didn't need to confront her. He didn't need to yell. She had signed a watertight, 90-page contract for this campaign. An NDA with a morality clause so strict it could bankrupt a small country. Basil leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The penthouse at the Meridian was a study in monochromatic minimalism. Slate gray, stark white, and brushed steel. When Basil unlocked the heavy mahogany door at 2 in the morning, the sprawling living room was submerged in the indigo shadows of the Los Angeles skyline. He stepped inside, the quiet hum of the climate control the only sound greeting him. Then, he heard the soft padding of bare feet against the heated hardwood. "Basil? Is that you, darling?" Camellia emerged from the hallway leading to the master suite. She was wearing a silk slip, a shimmering, liquid silver that clung to the curves he knew by heart. Her hair, usually blown out to voluminous perfection, was slightly mussed. Careful with the dress, Jules. The phantom audio played in his mind, overlaying the reality of his wife walking toward him. He stood motionless in the foyer. The sudden, violent urge to wrap his hands around her elegant throat was so visceral it made his fingers twitch. He forced them deep into the pockets of his tailored trousers. "I'm here, Cam," he said. His voice sounded surprisingly steady. A surgeon's voice. She closed the distance between them, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his chest. The familiar scent of her Tom Ford perfume filled his senses, but beneath the rich vanilla and tobacco, he thought he could detect something else. The sharp, acrid tang of another man's sweat. Or perhaps it was just his imagination, already dissecting her into tainted pieces. "You're working too late," she murmured, tilting her head back to look up at him. "The campaign launch is in 3 weeks. You need to rest, or you'll look exhausted next to my radiant self." She smiled. It was a breathtaking smile. 10 upper units of lithium disilicate glass ceramic, shade BL1, bonded flawlessly to her natural teeth. He had spent 20 hours in the lab just getting the translucency right, ensuring they caught the light like natural enamel, not dead chiclets. It was his masterpiece. Now, looking down at that perfect, expensive curve of white, all he saw was a gaping, grotesque lie. "Just making sure everything is perfect," Basil replied, matching her smile with a practiced, hollow one of his own. "Serafina sent over the raw files tonight. I had to review the audio." Camelia's eyelids didn't even flutter. Her pulse against his chest didn't skip a beat. She was a phenomenal actress. "Oh, how does it sound?" Julian said the acoustics in that dressing room were a nightmare. The acoustics were quite illuminating, he thought. "It's fine," Basil said, gently extricating himself from her embrace. He walked past her, heading for the kitchen island to pour himself a glass of water. His mouth was entirely dry. "We might need to redub a few lines in post-production. Nothing you need to worry about." "Good." She leaned against the marble counter, watching him drink. "Julian is brilliant, isn't he? He really knows how to capture the essence of a brand." "He certainly has a unique eye for detail," Basil agreed, setting the glass down. He looked at her, his expression carefully wiped clean of anything resembling human emotion. And a very hands-on approach. Camellia laughed, a light, musical sound, completely different from the guttural moan he had listened to an hour ago. "You're just jealous of his accent, darling." Basil walked back to her. He raised a hand, tracing the line of her jaw with his thumb, stopping just below her ear. He felt her lean into his touch, completely oblivious to the predator standing in front of her. He wasn't her husband anymore. He was the architect of her impending ruin. "I'm not jealous, Camellia," he whispered, pressing a cold kiss to her forehead. "I'm just protecting my investment." He walked past her toward the bedroom, leaving her standing alone in the dark kitchen. "Tomorrow, he would call his lawyers. Tonight, he had to lie next to a ghost. The morning sun hit the frosted glass walls of the clinic's conference room, casting a sterile, white glow over the mahogany table. Serafina, dressed in a sharp Balmain blazer, was pacing at the head of the room, projecting the final campaign mock-ups onto the screen. "We are blanketing the city," Serafina announced, her stiletto heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the hardwood floor. Sunset Boulevard, the glossy inserts in Vogue LA, and targeted social media pushes. Julian outdid himself with these shots. The lighting on Camellia is transcendent. On the screen, Camelia's face loomed larger than life. She was laughing, looking over her shoulder with an expression of effortless, radiant joy. The pristine white of her smile contrasted perfectly with the dark, moody background Julian favored. Sitting across from Basil, Camellia smiled warmly at the compliment, sipping her matcha latte. "Julian just makes it so easy to relax in front of the lens," she murmured. Basil rested his clasped hands on the table, feeling the cool metal of his wedding band against his skin. "Let her," Julian had whispered on the recording. "You look too tense, darling." "They are exceptional," Basil agreed smoothly, his voice betraying nothing. "The aesthetic perfectly aligns with the Vance veneer brand. Premium, untouchable, flawless." He let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second too long before shifting his gaze to the PR director. "However, given the scale of the capital we are injecting into this launch, I want to revisit the risk management protocols. Specifically, the contractor agreements." Serafina paused, a perfectly sculpted eyebrow arching. "The contracts are standard, Basil. Watertight. We use the same templates we use for A-list celebrity endorsements." "I want them tighter," Basil said, his tone casual but unyielding. He opened the leather-bound folder in front of him, pulling out a thick stack of stapled paper. "We are elevating Camellia from a local figure to the definitive face of a multi-million-dollar medical enterprise. Her public image is now inextricably linked to the clinic's valuation." Camellia sighed, a delicate, exasperated sound. "Basil, darling, please don't be tedious. I'm not going to start robbing banks or getting DUIs." "Of course not," Basil replied, offering her a brief, reassuring smile that felt like sliding a scalpel across his own face. "But we live in an era of rapid cancellations. I need the morality clause amended." Serafina crossed her arms. "Amended how?" "I wanted to explicitly state that any behavior, public or private, that fundamentally contradicts the core values of trust, integrity, and marital stability projected in this campaign will result in immediate termination of the contract." Basil leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Serafina's. "Furthermore, the penalty for such a breach must include full financial restitution of the campaign's production costs, payable immediately by the offending party. No severance, no mediation, a complete clawback." Serafina studied him for a long moment. She was a predator in her own right, attuned to the subtle shifts in power dynamics in Beverly Hills boardrooms. But Basil was a surgeon. He knew exactly how to hide the blood. "That is aggressively punitive," Serafina noted, tapping a manicured fingernail against her tablet. "Most talent wouldn't sign that without a fight." "Camellia isn't most talent," Basil countered smoothly. "She's my wife. It's merely a formality to satisfy my board of investors, to assure them that our internal house is in absolute order. Isn't that right, Cam?" Camellia waved a dismissive hand, her attention already drifting down to her phone. "Whatever makes you feel secure, Basil. Have your lawyers draft the amendment. I'll sign it. Can we get back to the launch party guest list now?" Basil watched her type a message on her phone, her thumbs moving rapidly. He wondered if it was to Julian, complaining about her boring, controlling husband. "Excellent," Basil said softly, closing the leather folder with a soft thud that echoed in the quiet room. "Security is exactly what I'm looking for." The West Hollywood studio was a cavern of exposed brick and blinding white light. Bass-heavy electronic music pulsed from hidden speakers, vibrating faintly through the concrete floor. Basil stood in the shadows near the catering table, a phantom in his own life, watching the final pickup shots for the billboard campaign. In the center of the glaring cyclorama wall, Camellia sat on a sleek leather stool, draped in emerald silk. Hovering inches from her was Julian. The photographer's camera fired in rapid bursts, the strobes flashing like a localized thunderstorm. "Give me that edge, Cam," Julian coaxed, his voice dropping into that familiar, intimate register. The same smooth baritone that had echoed through Basil's office speakers 2 nights ago. "Look right through the lens. On the room." Before hearing the audio, Basil would have seen nothing more than an eccentric professional at work. Now, the scales had fallen from his eyes. He saw the entire illicit choreography played out in plain sight. He saw the way Camelia's breathing shifted when Julian stepped into her personal space. He saw the subtle, electric tension in her shoulders relax only when Julian's hand reached out to adjust the collar of her gown. Julian's fingers lingered against her bare skin for a fraction of a second too long. It was a microscopic touch, invisible to the makeup artist chatting in the corner, invisible to the lighting assistants adjusting the softboxes. But to Basil, whose surgical profession required identifying millimeter-level imperfections, the gesture was as loud as a gunshot. Camelia's lips parted, and she offered Julian a private, knowing smirk before turning back to the camera with her brilliant, million-dollar smile. A wave of nausea washed over Basil, tight and cold in his gut. He reached into the inner pocket of his bespoke suit jacket and pulled out his phone. He didn't open his emails. He opened the camera app, switching it to video mode, and zoomed in. "Basil, I didn't know you were dropping by." Serafina materialized beside him, holding a clipboard and a paper cup of lukewarm espresso. She looked from him to the glowing screen of his phone. "Just capturing some behind-the-scenes footage." Basil lied effortlessly, his thumb resting securely on the record button. The board of investors loves seeing the process. It adds a narrative to the capital they are risking. "Julian is a genius," Serafina said, though her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched the photographer. "High maintenance, a bit of a diva, but he gets the shot. Though I wish he'd keep things moving. We are bleeding money on overtime studio rental." Basil caught the underlying edge in her voice. A flicker of genuine irritation, perhaps even resentment. He filed that detail away in the cold, analytical part of his brain. On his screen, he recorded Julian leaning in to whisper something into Camelia's ear under the guise of directing her posture. She laughed, a muted, suppressed version of the sound that haunted Basil's nights. He let the recording run, capturing 45 seconds of their undeniable, gravitational pull toward each other. The metadata was silently stamping the exact time, date, and GPS coordinates into the digital file. Digital concrete for the trap he was building. "Are we almost wrapped here, Serafina?" Basil asked, finally lowering the phone and sliding it back into his pocket. "I have a dinner reservation for Camellia and myself at 8. "Just 5 more minutes," Serafina assured him, turning away to bark an order at a lighting technician. Basil stood perfectly still, watching the flashbulbs erupt in a blinding rhythm. He felt a dark, terrifying calm settle over his racing heart. The evidence was no longer just an isolated, ambiguous audio file. He was building an entire catalog of their betrayal, brick by brick, frame by frame. He wasn't just observing a photo shoot. He was documenting the exact moments his wife was signing away her entire future. The offices of Bennett and Hayes smelled of polished leather, expensive espresso, and old money, a stark contrast to the sterile, ozone-filtered air of Basil's dental clinic. Sitting across an expansive glass desk, Arthur Hayes, a senior partner with silver hair and a perpetual scowl, slid a thick, freshly printed document toward Basil. Basil picked up the heavy Mont Blanc pen resting beside the stack of papers. He didn't look at the signature line yet. His eyes immediately flipped to page 42. Section 8, Morality and Public Conduct. "I've made the amendments exactly as you requested," Arthur said, his tone carefully neutral, the voice of a man accustomed to navigating the collateral damage of the ultra-rich. "But I have to advise you, Basil, this is highly irregular. You are effectively making the talent, your wife, personally liable for the entire sunk cost of the Vance Veneer campaign in the event of a breach. Basil read the densely packed legalese, his face an unreadable mask. Engages in conduct that brings the talent or the company into public disrepute, scandal, or ridicule, or shocks, insults, or offends a substantial portion or group of the community. And the financial penalty? Basil asked, his voice soft, never looking up from the crisp white page. A full corporate clawback, Arthur replied, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. Production costs, media buying, Julian's photography fees, Serafina's PR retainer, and calculated damages to the brand's valuation. We are talking a liability north of $8 million. Arthur paused, lowering his voice. Basil, her payout under your current prenuptial agreement is capped at $4 million. If this clause is triggered, it doesn't just negate the prenup. It bankrupts her entirely. That was exactly the mathematical equation Basil had spent the last 3 sleepless nights formulating. A standard divorce would give her half of his liquid assets, the Beverly Hills property, and generous alimony. She would leave him, take his money, and build a new life with her European photographer. A corporate lawsuit, however, triggered by a public breach of contract, would consume her. It would leave her with nothing but the designer clothes in her closet and the porcelain veneers he had permanently bonded to her teeth. The new investors require absolute security. Basil lied smoothly, turning to the next page. We are putting her face on billboards from Sunset Boulevard to the 405. If she were to, hypothetically, become embroiled in a public scandal, the clinic's reputation would be decimated. I am simply protecting my life's work, Arthur. Arthur studied him for a long, silent moment. As a corporate lawyer, he was paid to draft contracts, not to play marriage counselor. But he had known Basil for a decade. He knew the difference between a cautious businessman and a predator setting a snare. If you present this to her, Arthur cautioned gently, any competent independent counsel will tell her to run. She won't use independent counsel, Basil stated. She trusts me implicitly. She thinks this is just standard boilerplate for the corporate expansion. She thinks I am merely being a tedious, overcautious husband. The memory of Camellia laughing in their darkened kitchen, whatever makes you feel secure, Basil, echoed in his mind. She was so confident in her deception, so assured of his blind, pathetic devotion, that she wouldn't even bother to read the fine print. Her own arrogance was the final nail in her coffin. Basil capped the Mont Blanc pen and tapped it thoughtfully against the glass desk. Draft the final copy. I will have her sign it tonight before the final vendor payments go out. Everything needs to be legally binding before the launch party at the Velvet Room. As you wish, Arthur said, gathering the draft papers. It's a brutal document, Basil. I hope you never have to use it. So do I, Arthur, Basil murmured, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. So do I. It was the first honest thing he had said all week. He wished he never had to use it. He wished the audio file didn't exist, and he wished his marriage was real. But the rot was already deep inside the root, and the only cure left was a total, agonizing extraction. The thick, cream-colored cardstock felt heavy in Basil's hand, the gold foil lettering catching the light of the penthouse chandelier. Dr. Basil Vance cordially invites you to the exclusive unveiling of the Vance Veneer campaign at the Velvet Room. Camellia was pacing the length of their living room, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand, her phone pressed to her ear with the other. She was arguing animatedly with her stylist about the exact shade of crimson for her custom gown. Basil watched her over the rim of his scotch glass. Just 24 hours ago, she had signed the amended NDA without a second glance. She had been too busy texting under the table, likely Julian, complaining about her husband's boring legalities, to notice that the ink on the page was effectively signing away her financial existence. Yes, the silk crepe, Camellia said into the phone, her voice bright with adrenaline. It needs to contrast sharply with the black carpet. Everyone is going to be there. Vogue LA, Vanity Fair, news. It has to be immaculate. She ended the call with a satisfied sigh and turned to Basil, her eyes sparkling with genuine delight. Serafina really outdid herself with the press list, darling. It's not just medical trade magazines. It's a proper Hollywood event. Only the best for the face of the brand, Basil murmured, placing the invitation delicately on the marble coffee table. It was true. Serafina had pulled every string she had, but Basil had quietly doubled the PR budget behind her back. He had personally authorized the hiring of a secondary agency to ensure paparazzi swarmed the velvet ropes of the venue, and that high-profile gossip columnists were seated at the front tables near the stage. He wanted lenses. He wanted microphones. He wanted the blast radius of the scandal to be so massive that Camellia and Julian would never be able to show their faces in Los Angeles again. Camellia walked over to him, the silk of her robe parting slightly, and perched gracefully on the arm of his leather chair. She ran her manicured fingers lightly through his hair. "You've been so quiet lately," she noted, her tone a mixture of practiced affection and mild condescension. "Are you nervous about the board members? They're going to love the campaign, Basil. I promise you, this is going to make you the most sought-after cosmetic dentist in the country." She leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to his temple. The scent of her Tom Ford perfume, usually intoxicating, now felt like a suffocating shroud. "I'm not nervous about the board," Basil replied evenly, keeping his hands perfectly still in his lap so he wouldn't instinctively push her away. "I just want everything to be unforgettable. I want the unveiling to be a moment no one in that room will ever be able to unsee." Camellia laughed, a bright, melodic sound, completely oblivious to the lethal double meaning. "You are such a perfectionist." Julian said the exact same thing about the final video cut. He said the reveal is going to leave everyone entirely breathless. At the mention of Julian's name, a muscle in Basil's jaw feathered, a microscopic betrayal of his control, but he quickly smoothed his expression into a mask of polite interest. Julian said, they were openly discussing the launch together, probably sharing inside jokes about the foolish ATM husband funding their artistic and romantic endeavors. "I have no doubt Julian's cut will be revealing," Basil said softly. He looked at the gold foil invitation resting on the marble again. The Velvet Room was an underground, exclusive venue known for its absolute discretion and dark, opulent acoustics. It was the perfect place for a high society coronation, and an even better place for an execution. The trap was meticulously set, the audience was eagerly invited, and the victim was excitedly picking out the dress she would wear to her own slaughter. The penthouse was suffused with the pale, washed-out light of a hazy Los Angeles morning. 3 days remained until the Velvet Room launch. Basil sat at the kitchen island, methodically slicing a grapefruit. His movements were precise, surgical, and entirely devoid of life. Camellia stood across from him, waiting for the espresso machine to finish its grinding cycle. She wore a cashmere sweater that swallowed her frame, looking at him with a mixture of irritation and unease. The silence between them had grown dense over the past few days, thick enough to choke on. "You're doing it again," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet. Basil didn't look up. He carefully separated a segment of the fruit with a silver knife. "Doing what, Camellia?" "Withdrawing. You've been a ghost all week. You barely speak to me. You sleep on the far edge of the mattress, and every time I look at you, you're staring at me like I'm a puzzle you can't figure out." She crossed her arms, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against her elbows. "If you are this stressed about the board members and the PR metrics, you need to talk to Serafina. Don't take it out on me." Basil finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were flat, twin panes of dark glass. It took every ounce of his practiced willpower not to tell her that he had figured the puzzle out completely. He knew exactly where every dirty, broken piece fit. "I apologize," Basil said, his voice dropping into a low, soothing hum. It was the exact bedside manner he used for anxious patients before administering anesthesia. "The logistics are overwhelming. I just want everything to be flawless for you. I'm simply distracted." Camellia sighed, the tension leaving her shoulders in a rush of breath. She walked over and rested a hand on his shoulder. "I know, but you need to relax. I'm going to the spa this afternoon to decompress, and then I have a final fitting for the dress. I might be late." Take all the time you need, Basil replied, not flinching under her touch. 2 hours later, Basil was back in his private office at the clinic. The door was locked. The blinds were drawn. His computer monitor was dark, save for a single window open in the center of the screen. It was the integrated tracking application for Camelia's Porsche Cayenne. He watched the digitized map of Los Angeles. The small red icon representing her car had bypassed the wellness spa in West Hollywood entirely. Instead, it was weaving through the traffic of the Hollywood Hills, finally coming to a stop on a narrow, winding road in Laurel Canyon. Julian's residential address. Basil leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly in the silent room. He watched the red dot remain perfectly stationary. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. An hour. He didn't feel the blinding, suffocating rage anymore. That had burned away days ago, replaced by a chilling, absolute detachment. He opened a new folder on his desktop, meticulously screenshotting the GPS data, cross-referencing the timestamps with the dates of their previous spa days and late fittings over the past month. He compiled the digital footprints, building a fortress of undeniable evidence. The NDA required proof of a pattern of behavior that contradicted the core values of the brand. She wasn't just giving him an isolated incident. She was giving him a mapped, undeniable history of infidelity. Every minute that red dot stayed parked outside Julian's house was another $1,000 added to her impending financial ruin. Basil picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer's direct line. "Arthur," he said when the call connected. "The final pieces are in place. Prepare the breach of contract notification. I want it ready to be served by midnight on Thursday, immediately following the launch." The clinic was deserted, the silence absolute save for the faint hum of the servers in the adjacent room. Basil sat at his desk, the only light source emanating from the glowing screen of a silver MacBook Pro. It was the clinic-issued laptop Julian had used for 2 weeks to transfer high-resolution image files to the shared network. Julian was an artist, which meant he possessed a certain breed of arrogance, and arrogance inevitably bred carelessness. He had returned the laptop to the IT department without clearing his cache or logging out of his secondary browser profiles. For a man accustomed to the meticulous precision of dental surgery, recovering the active webmail session was a trivial exercise. Basil had originally intended to search for more geotag correspondence between Julian and Camelia. Instead, he found an archived email thread that shifted the entire tectonic foundation of his revenge. The subject line read, "Invoice adjustment, confidential." It was sent from an encrypted Proton address, but the signature and the aggressive, clipped syntax were unmistakably Serafina's. Basil clicked the thread, his eyes scanning the stark black text against the glaring white screen. Julian, the first email read, dated 3 weeks prior, the very day after the dressing room recording. "I review all raw footage before it hits the cutting room floor. All of it. I know what you are doing with the doctor's wife. You are a liability to my campaign. To ensure my silence, and to guarantee you remain the lead on this project, 40% of your total photography fee will be routed to the offshore LLC attached below. Consider it an insurance policy on your career." Basil's breath hitched, a cold, sharp intake of filtered air. He scrolled down to read Julian's frantic, cornered replies, and Serafina's cold, calculated ultimatums. She hadn't just discovered the affair. She had monetized his humiliation. The PR director he was paying $30,000 a month was double-dipping, feeding off the rotting carcass of his marriage to line her own pockets. She had sat in his conference room, praised Camelia's radiant smile, and demanded stricter contracts, all while holding the executioner's axe over the photographer's head. The sheer scale of the deceit was breathtaking. His entire inner circle was an ecosystem of parasites. Basil did not smash the laptop. He did not scream. The anger had crystallized into something far more dangerous, a quiet, absolute sociopathy. He methodically downloaded the entire email thread, exporting it as a secure PDF file, and forwarded it directly to Arthur Hayes with a single line of text. "Add corporate fraud and extortion to the PR director's file. She is now legally complicit in the NDA breach." He closed the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the office into profound darkness. Basil stood up slowly, the heavy silence of the clinic pressing against his eardrums. He walked across the marble floor until he reached the floor-to-ceiling window of his private suite. Below him, the luxurious boutiques of Rodeo Drive were shuttered and dark, a street of beautiful, empty facades. He stood alone, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. He looked at his own face, at the perfectly straight, meticulously whitened teeth that had built an empire. He had spent his entire life crafting flawless exteriors, ignoring the decay festering beneath the gums. "We finally have the perfect smiles, don't we?" Basil whispered to the empty, sterile room, the sound barely registering against the glass. "But there's nothing left to smile about." The velvet room, for hours before the doors were scheduled to open, was a subterranean cathedral of controlled chaos. Caterers in crisp black uniforms maneuvered around thick coils of electrical cables, arranging crystal champagne flutes on illuminated bars. Lighting technicians shouted to one another across the expansive, plush dance floor, testing the sweeping spotlights that would soon track Camelia's grand entrance. Basil stepped into the cavernous space, the heavy, soundproof doors sealing shut behind him. The air was a mixture of chilled floral arrangements, expensive floor wax, and the faint, metallic tang of ozone from the smoke machines. His pulse rested at a steady, surgical 60 beats per minute. He bypassed the frantic event coordinators and made his way to the elevated AV control booth overlooking the main stage. A young, stressed technician with heavy headphones draped around his neck was frantically adjusting sliders on a massive soundboard. Basil cleared his throat, and the technician spun around, instantly recognizing the man financing the entire spectacle. "Dr. Vance, everything is on schedule, sir," the technician said quickly, straightening up. "I know it is. You and your team are doing a phenomenal job," Basil replied, his voice a low, reassuring hum. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and extracted a sleek, titanium USB drive. "I have a final, last-minute update for the master presentation file. Serafina requested I hand-deliver it to ensure there is no compression loss over the network." It was a flawless lie, delivered with the absolute authority of a CEO. The technician didn't hesitate. He took the drive and plugged it into the primary console. Basil watched the glowing monitor. He watched the technician locate the file named Vance_Veneer_Launch_Final_V2 MP4 and drag it over, permanently overriding the polished, heavily edited promotional masterpiece Julian had spent weeks perfecting. The new file Basil had created the night before was a Trojan horse. It featured the exact same opening sequence, the swelling orchestral score, the sweeping drone shots of the Rodeo Drive clinic, the slow-motion, glamorous pan of Camelia's flawless face. But at the 45-second mark, the music would abruptly cut. The visuals would freeze on a dark, moody portrait of Camelia, and the audio track would violently shift to the raw, unedited feed from CM_audio_raw_4_dressing room. "File transferred and locked, Dr. Vance," the technician announced. "Do you want me to run a quick test on the mainline arrays? Make sure the levels are balanced?" "No," Basil said softly, his hand resting casually on the edge of the console. "Keep it entirely under wraps. I want the premiere to be a visceral, authentic experience for everyone in the room. Even the PR team hasn't seen this specific director's cut." The technician grinned, oblivious to the payload he was now guarding. "Got it. Blind reactions are the best." Basil left the booth and walked down the steps, standing alone in the center of the sprawling room. He looked up at the massive, dormant LED screen hovering above the stage. He knew exactly the magnitude of what he was about to do. Beverly Hills high society was a fickle beast. They tolerated whispered rumors, but they utterly abhorred vulgar, undeniable, public scandal. Once that audio played in front of the press and the investors, the Vance Veneer brand would instantly become a punchline. The clinic's valuation would evaporate overnight. His elite clientele would quietly transfer their records to discreet competitors by Monday morning. To trigger the catastrophic, million-dollar penalty clauses he had secretly woven into Camelia's and Serafina's contracts. The breach of morality had to be public and financially devastating to the company. He needed the VIPs. He needed the journalists. He needed the company to bleed so he could legally bleed them dry in return. Basil closed his eyes, feeling the heavy bass of a soundcheck reverberate through his leather shoes. He felt no hesitation. The empire he had built was a beautiful, hollow shell infested with parasites. He was a surgeon, and when a limb was gangrenous, you didn't try to polish the rotting skin. You amputated it. He opened his eyes, turning his back on the stage to go home, and put on his tuxedo. The operating room was prepped. The velvet room was a sea of flashbulbs, diamonds, and the intoxicating scent of expensive champagne. The launch of the Vance Veneer campaign had drawn the exact crowd Basil meticulously calculated: Vogue columnists, high-net-worth investors, and Beverly Hills socialites. They buzzed with anticipation, the low murmur of power and wealth vibrating through the room as their eyes fixed on the illuminated main stage. Standing at the center of it all was Camelia. She was a vision in custom crimson silk, the gown clinging to her like a second skin. Her porcelain smile, the very foundation of Basil's empire, beamed flawlessly under the sweeping spotlights. To her right, just off stage, Serafina stood with a clipboard, looking fiercely triumphant. In the front row of the VIP section, Julian crouched with his Leica camera, ready to immortalize the climax of his own supposed artistic genius. Basil stood near the edge of the stage, his tuxedo immaculate, his expression utterly unreadable. He tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear chime instantly silenced the cavernous room. Ladies and gentlemen, Basil's voice projected through the pristine sound system, echoing with practiced warmth. Tonight is not just about aesthetics. It is about truth. It is about what lies beneath the surface of a perfect image. The Vance Veneer brand is built on absolute transparency. And so, rather than a traditional speech, I want to share with you the raw, unfiltered reality of this campaign. For the first 45 seconds, it was a masterpiece of modern advertising. Sweeping, cinematic drone shots of the clinic bathed in golden hour light transitioned into slow motion, high-definition captures of Camelia laughing, tossing her hair, exuding pure, untouchable luxury. A sweeping orchestral score swelled through the concealed subwoofers, vibrating the floorboards. The audience was entirely mesmerized. Then, the music abruptly snapped off. The high-definition video vanished, replaced by a stark, pitch-black screen bearing only the clinic's sleek, minimalist logo. From the massive line arrays, a new sound emerged. It wasn't music. It was the harsh, hollow echo of the clinic's dressing room, amplified to deafening, concert-level proportions. God, finally, Camelia's breathless, unmistakable voice blasted through the silent ballroom. A ripple of confusion washed over the front tables. Julian lowered his camera, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Camelia's smile faltered slightly, her eyes darting toward the control booth, clearly assuming a catastrophic technical glitch. Careful with the dress, Jules. Serafina will have a stroke if it wrinkles. The collective breath of 300 people caught in their throats. Serafina froze, the color draining instantly from her face as the clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. Let her. Julian's low, intimate baritone echoed across the room. You look too tense, darling. The great doctor working you too hard? Camelia's hands began to tremble. The crimson silk of her gown suddenly looked less like a triumph and more like an open, bleeding wound. She stared down at Basil, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to hollow out her skull. Basil did not look away. He held her gaze, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. Then came the killing blow. Basil? Basil doesn't work me at all. He's so obsessed with those damn porcelain veneers. He doesn't even look at the real me anymore. Her cruel, mocking laughter filled the subterranean club, followed immediately by the wet, undeniable sounds of their physical entanglement. The moans, the rustle of fabric, the raw, unfiltered reality of her betrayal broadcast in high fidelity, to everyone she sought to impress. Pandemonium did not erupt instantly. The shock was too absolute, too paralyzing. The elite crowd sat frozen in a collective, horrified paralysis, forced to listen to the grotesque soundtrack of a marriage being butchered. Slowly, cell phones began to rise from the tables, recording the black screen, recording Camelia's total collapse as she sank to her knees on the stage, her trembling hands covering her face. The trap had snapped shut. The execution was televised, and Basil stood motionless in the wreckage, watching his life's work burn to ash. The audio finally clicked off, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a vacuum. Then, the vacuum shattered. It started with a single, blinding flash from a photographer in the second row, acting on pure, predatory journalistic instinct. That single flash was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Suddenly, the room erupted into a chaotic symphony of clicking shutters and shouted questions. The velvet ropes separating the press from the VIPs were trampled. The meticulously curated launch of Vance Veneer dissolved into a feeding frenzy. Camelia remained on her knees, her hands still covering her face, the crimson silk pooling around her like spilled blood. She wasn't fainting. She was paralyzed by the sheer, crushing weight of public exposure. Julian vaulted over the front table, his face pale, pushing past a bewildered investor. "Basil, what the hell is this? Turn it off," he yelled, his European accent thick with panic. Basil didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Two towering security guards, whom Basil had personally briefed hours earlier, intercepted the photographer before his foot could even touch the first step of the stage. They gripped Julian by the arms, their holds professional but painfully unyielding. "Let me go, Camelia," Julian shouted, struggling against the guards. Basil walked slowly to the edge of the stage, looking down at the struggling artist. "You are trespassing at a private corporate event, Julian, and you are officially terminated. Security will escort you out through the service elevator." Julian was dragged backward, his protests swallowed by the rising roar of the crowd. Basil turned his attention to the wings. Serafina was furiously tapping her earpiece, her pristine PR composure shattering. She lunged toward Basil, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and terror. "Have you lost your mind, Basil? You've just tanked the entire valuation of the clinic. The investors are walking out right now. I can't spin this." "I don't expect you to spin it, Serafina," Basil said softly, stepping closer to her so only she could hear him over the din. "I expect you to pay for it." She froze. "What are you talking about?" From the shadows of the VIP booths, Arthur Hayes emerged. The silver-haired attorney looked entirely out of place amidst the panic, holding a sleek leather briefcase. He extracted two thick manila envelopes. "We recovered the laptop Julian returned to IT," Basil whispered, his voice as cold as liquid nitrogen. "We found the encrypted email threads. The offshore LLC. You didn't just fail to protect the brand, Serafina. You actively concealed a catastrophic breach of morality to extort 40% of a vendor's fee. That is corporate fraud." Serafina's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking haggard and old. Arthur handed her the first envelope. "Notice of immediate termination for cause, Miss Serafina, and a preliminary injunction freezing your company's assets pending a full audit and lawsuit for damages." Basil left the ruined PR director staring blankly at the legal document and walked over to his wife. Camelia looked up at him through tear-streaked mascara. The flawless porcelain veneers were now framed by trembling, colorless lips. "Basil, please," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper against the flashing lights. "Why? Why like this?" Arthur handed Basil the second envelope. Basil crouched down, perfectly balancing on the balls of his expensive shoes, and placed the heavy document on her lap. "Because a quiet divorce would have left you comfortable, Camelia," Basil replied, his tone conversational, devoid of any hatred or love. "By signing that amended NDA, you assumed personal financial liability for the brand's reputation. This public scandal, triggered by your documented actions, constitutes a catastrophic breach." Camellia stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. What does that mean? It means you owe the clinic $8 million, Basil stated coldly. The prenup is void. You are bankrupt. You have nothing. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs, and turned his back on the crying woman who was once his world, leaving her to the blinding flashes of the paparazzi. 6 months had passed since the night at the Velvet Room. The Los Angeles autumn brought a crisp, dry chill to Rodeo Drive, but inside the Vance Veneer Clinic, the climate control kept the air perpetually set to a sterile, unfeeling 68 degrees. Basil sat in his private office, his mahogany desk completely clear of patient files. The legal bloodbath had been swift, brutal, and absolute. Arthur Hayes proved to be as lethal in a deposition room as Basil was in a surgical theater. The amended morality clause held up perfectly against the desperate appeals of opposing counsel. Camellia was utterly ruined. Stripped of the prenuptial protections, her assets were systematically seized to satisfy the catastrophic $8 million penalty. The designer wardrobe, the jewelry, the Porsche Cayenne with its damning GPS history, all liquidated. She was last reported to be living in a cramped, rented apartment deep in the valley, her flawless porcelain veneers now a permanent, mocking reminder of a luxury she could never again afford. Julian had vanished entirely. Blacklisted by every major agency and magazine in California, facing crippling debt from his own breached contracts, he had quietly fled back to Europe. His artistic reputation was permanently branded as toxic. Serafina's PR empire collapsed within a month. The leaked emails detailing her extortion not only triggered the corporate NDA clauses, but also caught the immediate attention of federal tax auditors investigating her offshore LLC. She was currently facing multiple counts of wire fraud. Basil had executed a flawless, surgical strike. He had exterminated the parasites. He had won the war. Yet, as he stood up and walked out of his private suite, his footsteps echoed with an agonizing, hollow rhythm down the long marble hallway. The sprawling waiting room, once bustling with A-list actors, tech billionaires, and socialites, was completely deserted. The plush Italian leather chairs sat vacant. The grand reception desk was unmanned, the phone lines dead silent. Beverly Hills forgave many sins. They forgave greed, they forgave ruthless ambition, and they often forgave quiet, discreet infidelities. But they never forgave public, messy, undeniable humiliation. The Vance Veneer brand was radioactive. High society clients, terrified of the visceral scandal and the man who had orchestrated it so coldly, had quietly requested their medical records be transferred to competitors. The multi-million-dollar valuation of the clinic had evaporated into thin air. Basil owned a pristine, state-of-the-art medical facility that no one wanted to enter. He walked into the primary operating suite. The leather surgical chair was perfectly angled, the articulated LED lights shining down brightly on absolutely nothing. He had amputated the gangrene to save his pride, but in doing so, he had bled his own empire dry. The revenge was so absolute that it left no room for his own survival. Basil walked back to his office. He poured himself a glass of Macallan 18, the heavy crystal clinking softly in the profound, suffocating silence of the empty clinic. He walked slowly over to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below him, the streets of Rodeo Drive were alive. Wealthy patrons moved between boutiques, a world of beautiful, artificial facades carrying on entirely without him. He stood alone, looking out through the thick pane of glass at the darkening Los Angeles skyline. He took a slow sip of the scotch, feeling the familiar burn slide down his throat. He caught his own reflection in the window, the tailored suit, the impeccably steady hands, the immaculate, artificially white teeth. He had spent his entire life meticulously crafting the perfect exterior, and now, that was all he had left. We finally have the perfect smiles, don't we? Basil whispered to his ghost in the glass. But there's nothing left to smile about.